Uh, we've got the recording going here. So my name's Lucinda, and basically as those of you know me, I've got background in learning and development. Actually, I wrote a book on change, and this is where I did quite a lot of work on culture and understanding it and culture change itself. And it is quite a tricky topic, if I'm honest. It's quite a lot to it. So interested to know what interests you about this. I also host a podcast called the HR Uprising. If you haven't come across that, might be worth checking it out. We will put a link in, which there's a very relevant podcast episode that we did quite a while ago, but it's still a really popular one. So we'll drop that into the chat as well. In terms of my day job, so I'm also the founder and CEO of a company called Actus. So we specialise in software, performance management software, and various other aspects of software that we do. I also do learning and development and organisational development consultancy. Coco from Nigeria, here we go. You are lucky, Rowan, that it's rather north. It is so miserable here. One of the things just to flag is people don't always realise, they think we just do performance management, but we also have a product called Actus 360, which is 360 feedback and survey, and it is a tool that could be really relevant if you are measuring culture or trying to develop culture. So I thought it was worth just dropping that up there and flagging that right at the start. So in terms of what we are going to focus on today, is we're going to focus on how you might diagnose your culture. I'm going to look at a range of different ways in which we might diagnose organisational culture, how you might define your sort of as is. And if you were trying to do culture change, and if you are interested in culture change, then the webinar I'm doing in March is all about change. Then you could use this as a sort of starting point for defining your culture, and then we'll look at how you actually change it in March in terms of managing that. But we'll look at the sorts of tools you might use to diagnose culture, to get to understand your organisational culture, if you're starting to sort of scope something in terms of your role within an organisation. So putting an open question up here, so encourage you using the chat if you want to, although I do know this is probably the hardest question to get someone to answer. I've got a long definition on my next slide and on a short definition, but I wondered if any of you have got any definitions, how you might define what culture, and then in a moment I'll also give you the option to actually how you might define culture that you've got, because I can see we've got people here, so someone who's works for a tech, you've got a tech brand or public sector. Very often they have very different cultures, and the businesses that I've worked in have had very different cultures as well, just looking at where you are. So primary care, if you're in NHS, that is entirely different culture, isn't it? Here, civil servants, yeah, and then we've got small charities. So how different the cultures are and should be and what they need to be. So yeah, Chantal, well done. You've got I have got that one. The how things are done around here is a kind of a well-known, really nice shortcut definition. Siobhan's saying it's how people feel about working for your organisation and how things are done. Absolutely, unwritten rules of things. Tara's saying it's our personality, how we do things comes through in all that we do and how we talk about ourselves, how your workplace or working environment feels, how we do what we do from a non-technical perspective. So it's very human, isn't it? It's very people-y, isn't it? Great. Is that Mike Adenal? I know, are you a regular person? I'm just trying to remember. Let me know. Is it Mike? I'm trying to remember your first name. Yes, great. Just remembering there. And team action surrounds me. Absolutely. Creating tradition. So here's my wordy definition from Spencer, Oty, and Franklin here, which says that culture is a fuzzy set of basic assumptions and values, orientations to life beliefs, policies, procedures, and behavioural conventions that are shared by a group of people and that influence, but do not determine each person's behaviour and their interpretations of the meaning of others' behaviour. It's a really long sentence, isn't it? I get it. I get it. And then many of you here have also come up with the sort of how we do things around here, the shortcut one, which is Charles Handy, the good old OD expert. Absolutely. And what's interesting is, yeah, Pooja, that's an interesting one, the behaviour of people and the quality of care. So that's what's delivered people, and particularly in the NHS or public sector. Sometimes there is a discrepancy between what the stated culture is or should be and what the behaviours actually are. And that's when you feel you might have a cultural issue you've got underneath it in terms of how things really are. So thinking about the organisations that you work for, how would you define your organisational cultures there? What would you come up with? Have you got terms there? I'm going to share something called competing values framework in a moment, which will give some other language for you to use, but just letting you to think about, what do you think of the culture of your organisation? Would you be able to easily describe it? Some organisations have pockets of different cultures, depending on which department you're in, which team you're in. I remember the organisation I used to work for as a large German engineering firm, but it had different entities within it. And the entity that I worked for, because of the sector it was in, was much faster moving. It was more sort of market driven and competitive, whereas some of the other aspects of that same business were very much more hierarchical. So I'm seeing is it tricky for you to describe your culture? Let me give you this competing values framework, and then I'll give you the opportunity to use that to maybe describe it. So I don't know if you've heard of the, oh, well done, Serene, you've gone for it. Client-centered, fast-paced, fun, inclusive. Oh, I want to come and work for you. That looks good. There's a culture that the organisation tries to project, says Glenn, but the reality is that each team have evolved. And actually that's interesting, isn't it? Where sometimes there's an espoused culture, but not necessarily something that's, that's the same within it, may not feel the same. And then you've got one around interesting, flexible, friendly, but inconsistent. That's tricky as well. Maybe if it's a new business or a smaller business, when you're trying to grow and establish a culture, there can be variations. Trying to establish processes, working in a smaller business, you don't necessarily have established processes, so things can be inconsistent. There are advantages to that, but there are also, disadvantages. So you tried to define it recently, Mike. That's interesting. So let's see if this is useful actually for you. So the competing values framework, it was a model defined by Robert Quinn and Kim Cameron, and they use it to help understand the different values in an organisation. And so you can see that they've got these two axes here, really about, so that you can perhaps think of your organisation that you work within, how flexible it is versus stability. So quite a lot of what you've said so far have said flexible. Often it's the older, more mature businesses, which would be more stable, or public sector, I would expect to be more stable at the bottom end of it. And then the middle axis is it more externally focused, i.e. looking at the external marketplace, or is it more internally focused and driven by internal processes and procedures? So that might help you to put your own organisation into one of those areas. So those are sort of natural tensions, basically, because, organisations, yes, you could argue that we want to be in the centre. It does depend on what you're trying to achieve, I guess. So you're thinking about whether it's flexible or stable, and is that most appropriate to your company vision effectively? And then if you look at the axes, how does it sort of feel to work there? If you are in the, what they call the clan, that's like a family firm type approach, the focus is more on flexibility, internal focus. If you're in that organisation, you probably prioritise teamwork. It'd be about employees, and things are done by consensus. So that can be great. Although it can also feel, if it's clan-like, sometimes that, let's say it is a sort of family business that's established, that all the decisions are made in a darkened room between the people who are the leaders of the clan. So there's pros and cons to any of these type things. As the company might grow, then it might be felt that they're not so easy for those things to share. Then you might be having your adhocracy. So in theory, these are high in innovation. So it might be entrepreneurial, so very market driven, taking risks, dynamic, creative and entrepreneurial spirit. So that might be something where you really want to be first to market, or you've very highly competitive market, or got a new product. So you see that if you are operating in a clan process and you need to be more market driven, you might need to think about being more of an adhocracy. Then you've got your compete the market one. So these ones are prioritizing competition achievement, market success, very much in terms of that measure there, very results driven. You'd have lots of competitive sales type targets and that sort of thing. And then you've got control, which is more about efficiency, consistency and control. And I say that public sector, the NHS, really has to be that kind of thing. But of course, that's why it's so hard to change, because it's very stable and processed, and it's got clear structure, rules and processes, and woe betide breaking those processes. So that can make them very slow to be responsive to customers or to the market, for example. So they've all got pros and cons. And actually, if this is something that you're interested in, you can measure it. There is actually a measure that you can get called the it's called the Organisational Culture Assessment Instrument, OCAI. So you can Google it, and we'll aim to try and find it and drop it in the notes. But also, I did the podcast on it, which Laura's going to drop in the chat for us, which is quite a good one. The lady, it was a great expert, it was a really well received one, and it's got links there to it if you wanted to do more on this particular framework. So you could look at this framework, you could actually analyse your organisation. Actually, I don't know if any of you have done that, if any of you used the competing values framework, and you could then say, actually, where are we currently, and what are our values, or what's our vision, and see how you stack up against it. So you can analyse the organisation. And again, this is where if you were trying to create culture change, you might use a tool to analyse your leadership behaviours and see whether they're in line with where you want. Yes, Nina, and I didn't say that at the beginning, so I forgot to say that, so thank you for asking the question. No problem, you arrived late. We are recording this and we will send the slides out to you and the recording. And I will probably record a podcast on the content as well, because it's fairly meaty content, so I will do that as well so people can revisit it. So that's your competing values framework. Do let me know if you've come across it. And like I say, you can actually use it as a questionnaire that you can use. Slightly more, I'm seeing, oh, actually, and I was going to get you to, let me just put a poll up, just out of interest. Where do you see yourselves in terms of this particular one? So, oh, do you know what? I created a poll and I think I've forgotten to save it. Have I? So it's going to get us to do this. Never mind. Which one? Where would you put yourself? Collaborate. Was Emma thinks she's collaborate, control. So again, you're housing association, Richard, aren't you? So that would make sense. You have to be there. So it's thinking, where would we put ourselves currently, and is that serving us? So interesting to see where that is. Great idea to do a poll. Even better idea to save a poll. So then let's look at, while you're popping those up here, the Culture Onion. I think that's what it's called, by Edgar Schein, who's a sort of long-standing, it's quite an old one, this. I think it's from the 50s or 60s. And his is quite simplistic. Now, actually, anyone who's eagle-eyed may recognise that I've adapted this. So the Culture Onion, Edgar Schein talks about visible artefacts, espoused values, and underlying assumptions. When I wrote about this in my book, I thought, you know what, leadership behaviours are so important in terms of culture. I feel like that should be part of the onion, particularly if you're thinking about trying to change things. So effectively, the outer aspect of your onion is a visible artifacts. So, you know, company logos, do you wear a uniform? Things like when they used to talk about the .com, you know, have we got exciting pool tables in our reception, or that sort of thing, bean bags. So those sort of things which sort of are indicative of the culture on the outside. Then you've got your espoused values, which is saying what you say your culture is. So they're espoused. Of course, we all know that sometimes there is a difference between the espoused and natural behaviours. And then you have your underlying assumptions, which is what people really think. So you could have a conflict in something like that, where our espoused values is that we really value people and well-being, but the underlying assumptions are that you've got to work really long hours in order to be successful. So there's a bit of a conflict in that kind of thing. But for me, the glue between the two of those that we shouldn't overlook is really the behaviours of leaders. Or if you want to change it or identify the disconnect, you know, how do you get to an assumption? Assumptions in people's heads. So the only way in which you change those is how your leaders behave, in my opinion. So that's not Edgar Schein. Now, Edgar Schein just said the three. I'd be, if we're rethinking culture, we need to think about how do our leadership behaviours align with our espoused values and reinforce them if they don't, or do they, you know, actually reinforce the underlying assumptions, in which case you've got a kind of conflict. And if we're looking at culture change, we would need to think about ourselves as change agents, being prepared to challenge those leadership behaviours or measure those leadership behaviours, and hold a mirror up to our leaders for them to see where there's a disconnect. And that's what we could do in terms of rethinking it or changing things. And then the third model that I think is really useful, again, if you are planning to rethink culture in your organisation, is the cultural web. This comes from Exploring Corporate Strategy, is the book that it came from. And I think it's really quite useful. Actually, again, if you want any documents on this, Laura, you might be able to find it quite easily Googling. With the book, well, there's a bunch of resources that I did in HR, the Change Toolkit resources that I created in line when I wrote my book. And you can download templates on things like this cultural web as part of that. So again, we'll put the link in, we'll then save it out to you if you want to access that Change Toolkit. But this is thinking about, so you've got your organisational paradigm, which is basically sort of the mindset, which you could probably align that with the Cameron and Quinn. Thanks, Laura. With the Cameron and Quinn. So is your paradigm, compete? Is it adhocracy? What is that paradigm? How do you see yourself? What's the mindset of our organisation? And then you can look at these other areas if we want to change them. So there's some overlap. So things like, I guess, the rituals and routines. That's a little bit about, that's very similar to what we were talking about in terms of the artifacts and things on the outside of the shine one. Of course, you'd expect to see overlap. So things like symbols again as well, so those would be external things. So logos, images, things that we do on a regular basis. There's also things like stories, narratives, legends in your organisation. So-and-so, came in raging drunk and nothing happened to them. That would be, I worked for a pharmaceutical company 20 years ago, and those sort of things were stories and myths. Actually, some of them were true, because some of them start there. Another classic story myth from the German company that I worked for was the FD once stood looking over the car park and said, "Oh, and there is our greatest asset." And the person next to him said, "Oh, right, our people." I went, "No, it's our company car fleet," because they then sold that off and got some money on the bottom line. So those sort of things. Of course, a story and myth like that is great because that just gives you the example that we value, that company values money or cars over people. So that perpetuates sort of this sort of view or the actual values of a company. And if the FD says something like that, and then you've got on the wall your values, we value people, or people are our greatest asset, you can see there's a conflict. So these sort of things are great ways in which you can understand those. But again, those sort of things, the stories and myths, they're really hard. They're those underlying assumptions or the origins of those. Rituals and routines. Do we have weekly sales meetings, board meetings? What sort of things happen on a regular basis? Or, do we go down the pub on a Friday? Those give you an indication of a culture. But you can't change things from that sort of outside, from those sort of way in many ways. Often what you have to look at as other things like power structure, control systems, and the organisational structure. So if you're wanting to be more nimble and faster working, but you've got a really hierarchical structure that everything has to be signed off, you want to sign off 50 quid, it has to go to someone second in command, then that is going to make you much more hierarchical. So if we wanted to change those things, we have to think about each of these areas. What could we change in turn? And so I think the cultural web is quite a useful tool. And we have got a template on that, but you could just do your own, basically. If you wanted to think, where are we currently? So that's on the left-hand side is my as is example. And there is the company that I've referred to, which many of you know me well enough as to know where it is, but I won't name them on this example. So this is how they were, this particular company. So great, they're very hierarchical, reliable, trustworthy, quality and research driven. However, they were in a market where they were being beaten by market driven organisations. So if we looked at our Cameron and Quinn, the bottom right hand corner, those competition. So that the big competitor out there was kind of diametrically opposite. They were more externally driven and they were doing better because they were competitive. But you can't sort of turn the Titanic round really quickly. It's very tricky. So how do you make those tweaks? But fundamentally, to do that culture change, to be able to be more responsive and customer focused, you had to look at these other approaches. So needed to be more team-based or matrix-based, needed to be less bureaucratic, really, in terms of making changes. Now, on the flip side, if you've been a small business, you might say this too erratic. We need to be more structured. in making decisions. We need to keep control of our organisation. We're spending money on things erratically, we don't know where it's going. So, it's not always you have to go one way from hierarchy to market. It's about what's appropriate for your organisation or your business and where you need to be. So that just gives you a tool that if you were trying to analyze your business, in fact, there's 3 tools there. Most likely you might want to use the Cameron and Quinn and maybe the cultural web. So where do we think we are currently? And you could work people, and where do we need to be? And then it helps you think, what do we need to do to bridge that gap? I think they're quite practical ways, considering that culture is a really difficult concept to kind of get your head around. It is kind of lots of it, as I say, is unspoken. Then these are ways in which you can start to make those changes, or at least define what the change needs to be and then put them in place. Do chuck any questions you've got in the chat. I realise there's quite a lot of content in this. Oh, great. What's on thing? Does culture all link to business purpose? Yeah. So that is about purpose, isn't it? The why, and that's the Simon Sinek stuff is all about tapping into individuals' purpose, isn't it? And where you want to go. And I think certainly from an engagement point of view and people being driven and motivated, that certainly works. The reality is, I think if we're trying to understand, many of us work in organisations where individuals may not feel that they've got their why. So by all means, we should start with that why. I feel that this is a little bit different. I'm thinking about if you've got an organisational strategy that you need to compete in a different marketplace, you need to adapt to launch a product, you need to survive in a recession. Those are things which, starting with why is lovely, but you might also need to look very practically at some of these external, more visible things. That's my take on it. Really interested in anyone else's comments on Richard's question there. Thought-provoking question from Richard, thank you. In terms of the things that I might use, or you might use in terms of these, so if you want to assess where you are, I've talked about there's the OCI, you could assess where you think things are. For me, I think it's quite key to understand whether the culture is where you think it is or the organisation thinks it is. So is there a connection or a disconnect between it? So examples where you've had people saying, oh, I've worked with a fire service where there was actually probably cultural issues at the top. They all thought, we're really people oriented, responsive with customer, we're doing it all right, but actually lower down, if you surveyed people or did focus groups, there was a sort of sense of bullying, actually. So you have things where people say there's a bullying culture. Well, what is that? And those sort of things, the best way to diagnose that, there's a bit about questionnaires. It may come through in an engagement survey, but also it could be focus groups. So if you're asking open questions, and they might say, well, it's those, or if you're looking at diversity, if we want to encourage that, make an inclusive culture, that's when you hear things that come out in focus group, that there's banter or microaggressions. So sort of things like that, asking questions about, how do we communicate around here? What's funny around here? What are our rituals? How inclusive is going to the pub on a Friday? Those sort of things. So you could do focus groups to ask people how they define our culture and see whether it differs in different aspects of your organisation. If you've got organisational values, you could do leadership. You could put those into a 360 tool and get the leaders to be assessed against those values. So they might think they are espousing or living the espoused values, but what do other people think in terms of those? Surveys and questionnaires, we can use those. Cultural audits, those are the ones I'm talking about. You could use those tools that we've just talked about. And you can benchmark culture in theory against other similar organisations. I have to say, I'm not 100% sure where you'd go for that. Please tell me if anyone knows, or has anyone benchmarked their culture? You're more likely to be able to do it, I imagine, in larger industries, or again, maybe public sector. Oh gosh, we've got some real thought-provoking questions here. So Mike's saying the two can be totally separate. You could work in the same sector delivering the same product, but have culture. Yes, 100%. Have cultures which are polar opposites. So how it feels to be in that organisation, for sure, as a human. And that's why you might choose to work in another organisation. And that's where I think the leadership is so key. That's the Edgar Schein thing. You can't just, it's not just about what you say you are, it's actually how you manage, because that's one of the biggest effects is, how does your line manager interact with you? How does your team interact? How does it feel to be there? Do you think an organisational strategy should shape their culture, or should an thank you, Emma, or should an organisation's culture shape their strategy? Well, I think there's a difference between should and what reality is. So Emma has popped in. I nearly put that in the slides. Oh, it's gone out of my head. Who said that now? Drucker, Peter Drucker. Emma has put culture eats strategy for breakfast. So this is the key, really. I think most organisations would like to be able to choose their culture and for the strategy to be everything. But the reality is, it doesn't matter how amazing your vision and strategy is, if the culture is such that I don't know, people are not supported, people are not bought into it, they don't have their why, they're disengaged. It doesn't matter how amazing your strategy is, it's really not going to get you very far. So yes, culture eats strategy for breakfast, Peter Drucker quote. So really, this is the key. If you guys are trying to drive your organisation forward and you know that you've got some cultural issues, you brush them under the carpet at our peril, really, because it is going to affect us being successful. Keep the questions coming. So how do we make it happen? There's lots of things. It's for me, if I was going to make culture change happen, and I'll say I'll build on this concept in terms of managing change. If you want to join us in our March March webinar, for me, working with your leadership team. So let's define what is our as is and our to be, and let's communicate the to be as a vision. So it's going beyond what we're going to be in the marketplace. It's kind of how we're going to do it, because often our values or our competencies are our how. So maybe being really clear about that. Now, of course, you might communicate your how, and that's what lots of organisations do by saying, these are our values. This is what we are. This is what we stand for. If you know there's a discrepancy between those, then we need to look at how can we basically gain leadership buy-in to this. And the culture change is absolutely going to start from the top, and you need to be alert to people who are sort of undermining it. So getting buy-in from these and making sure that they embody the values that they're espousing, and they're prepared to be role models, really. Really useful to involve employees in this sort of thing as well, because that's where, I mean, I would involve them to start with in terms of the definition, talking to people about it, but also you can come up with things like charters if you're trying to make a change. So I've worked with some organisations about maybe a management charter as to how do we behave in terms of our performance management, for example, those sort of things. So engaging others is always more useful. And again, that's about change in terms of taking people with us. You need to make sure that your processes and structures are not undermining it. It's basically making sure that things are not misaligned is really, really key. When you start to make the change, be prepared to recognise people doing it. That's really, really helpful. And of course, training people, developing people, providing feedback, which I've touched on a few times here. So those were the main things that I would look at if I wanted to. The purpose here really is thinking about how do we rethink culture? And if we want to rethink it, we need to first define where we are currently and where do we think it should be. And then, of course, we think, how do we do it? And it's all about people, because of course culture is all about people. Let's have a quick look here in the chat there, and I'll pop up. I think Laura has already promoted the webinars that are coming up. So we've got, I'll pop those up here in terms of these. So our other webinars will invite you to them automatically. We're talking about change, and also let me know if there's other subjects. But any other questions or comments that we've got here? It's a challenge moving to culture by the time the shift has happened. Oh my word, Sylvia, that I talk about that a lot in terms of change management, particularly if you work somewhere like the NHS. Some of the reason I would say it does take a while, and by the time she's saying by the time the shift has happened, a new move is necessary. It is a journey. Culture change is a journey. One of the reasons it can be painful, though, is that sometimes it's not driven through to completion. The 7-step Cotter does a culture change model, and I will talk about that in March. Or you can find it on the podcast. But if you look at that, one of the things that happens really commonly.
Hello. Is one driving
someone please.
Oh,
hang on, sorry, you're talking to me. I'm not sorry, everybody. I'm not quite sure whether that's. Do let me know if you're trying to unmute and talk to me, or if someone's letting someone in. But I think one of the tricky things is that change is not embedded quite often, and that's often because we don't embed processes. We leave our processes the old way and just tell people to change, because communication of change happens, but then nothing is reinforcing it. So maybe the training doesn't happen, or the processes still reward the old way. So that's one of the things I believe there. At the end of the day, you're never going to culture change overnight unless you're a really small organisation and everybody's very, very committed to making a specific change, and it's going to be driven in, because it's kind of the way people work. So it doesn't happen overnight, that kind of thing. Mike saying agile working acceptance that cultural values and viewpoints will change. What work? So and then we are all evolving. The main thing is, I think, evolving consciously and in the direction that we want to go in. So it is quite a tricky one, isn't it? So those were the key points that I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your comments and questions. I say, please do register for the other webinars. I've also let this up here because we're going to do a different, and we might do more of these this year, is where I'm going to bring guests in on certain topics. So a lady called Kat Wildman joined me on the HR Uprising podcast recently. She's great, a real diversity, equity and inclusion expert. And so we thought we'd do a sort of live Q&A type approach with her. So if you fancy that, if that's a topic you're interested in, please do register and actually let us know any questions that you've got as well. Okay, thank you so much for joining today. Just wrapping up, a reminder of, if you want to do anything on 360, we have that offering, and we will be promoting that in March with some special offers, and all of the links will come out to you as well. So we'll send these out to you along with the recording. Thank you for joining.